This is part this is part 9 of Robert Temple's A New Science of Heaven read through. In this, hopefully we'll get through chapter 17 and possibly 18. Again, disclaimer, this is for educational purposes only. The views and beliefs and writing of the author is entirely his. They do not necessarily reflect or are compatible with my own personal views, although I think there might be a little bit of some overlap in some regards. I do not and will not produce any medical, legal, or any other kind of advice on this channel, on this recording, or any other such recordings, because I don't want to get my ass sued or whatever. Only reading through what Temple has wrote. So without further ado, let's get to the text. Chapter 17, Our Plasma Selves. Fields contribute not only energy, but information too. Information that may play a vital role in the triggering intelligence, both in humans and in plasmas in space. We now come to what interests embody the most ourselves. Let me read that again. We now come to what interests everybody the most, ourselves. It is possible that we are really much more than we think we are. So much more, in fact, that we transcend our physical bodies even while we are alive, quote unquote. And after we die, quote unquote, we are still very much around, just invisible and somewhat out of touch. There is every reason to think so. I have already made plain how rare physical and or atomic matter is in our plasma universe. So if we have plasma bodies, it is only to be expected. After all, why should we not have plasma bodies? Most things are made of plasma, so why not us? In this chapter, I will advance the argument by describing some more details of what our plasma bodies may be like. A very interesting angle is provided by information theory and a parallel school of thought called bioinformation. Information theory was first articulated in 1948 with elaborate mathematical precision by Claude Elwood Shannon, 1916 to 2001. Building on the work of 19th century logician George Boole, 1815 to 1864, who realized that logic could be used not only as a closed system, but to solve problems in the real world, and working in parallel with another math genius, Alan Turing, 1912 to 1954. Shannon realized that intelligent machines could be built out of simple logic junctions with binary yes or no answers. Crucially, he saw how these machines might be used as more than just calculators, but as entities that might act in the real world. We can think of this on the model of a thermostat. If information is fed into it, that the temperature of water, for example, has reached a certain level, then the thermostat will act, quote unquote, by switching heat on or off. This sort of logic junction can, in principle, be replicated an infinite number of times, primed with different algorithms according to what its engineer wants to achieve. Increasing the information storage and processing capacity of these machines give rise to the invention of CDs and mobile phones, as well as the Voyager space missions, the development of the internet, and of artificial intelligence. But more important for our purposes here is that putting information theory into practice by building intelligent machines helped us to reassess what counts as intelligence. We began to see our own intelligence in a new light, as a series of chemical reactions and more the processing and communication of information. It also became possible to recognize the operation of intelligence in other areas of the universe, in plants, for instance. In biology, processes such as growth can be seen as occurring when information encoded in the double helix in the form of DNA is communicated at conception. The roots of bioinformation, quote unquote, go back to 1915 when a Russian scientist named Alexander Leonidovich uh, Chizevsky, also Chizevsky, all these different spellings, 1897 to 1964, aged only 18, began a systematic study of the relationship between biological phenomena and large-scale cosmic events. By the age of 20, he was already lecturing at Moscow University as well as at the Moscow Archaeological Institute. From 1922, however, he concentrated entirely on his biophysics work, and by 1940 he had established by experiments the various cosmic and magnetic phenomena that had distinct effects on organisms. Separately, in 1935, a group of Japanese scientists led by M. Takada showed that the rate of human blood clotting was related to solar activity. This was confirmed by later scientists. All such early work relating to electrical and magnetic influences upon the human body had a big effect on another young Russian scientist named Alexander Samuilovich Presman, 1909 to 1985, who devoted most of his life and career to following up on it. In the course of the book, we have looked at hints at fields such as the electromagnetic that pervade the universe might interact with plasma to create the conditions necessary for intelligence to evolve. Their interactions are not simply a matter of energy, but the communication of information too. This was Presman's whole study. After many years of work and study and experimentation, in 1968, Presman published a book so stupendous in its summary of experimental findings by himself, his colleagues, and his predecessors that it can be described as a classic, a milestone, and a fundamental work of reference. His book was published by the Nauka Science, quote unquote, press of Moscow and was instantly spotted in the West, so that the English translation was published in 1970 with the title Electromagnetic Fields and Life. A huge amount of meticulous translation and editing went into this translated book, the English of which is flawless. As I mentioned earlier, this is a very unusual feature for translated Russian scientific works. The publication was made possible by special permission of the USSR authorities. Presman was by this time at the Department of Biophysics in the Faculty of Biology of Moscow University and may also have had special funding from America, which is not specified. The book is 336 pages long and filled with bewildering, indeed an overwhelming amount of detailed information. But it is the last 139 pages of the book that were to have such a powerful impact on what matters most to us. For it was in that section that Presman elaborated this concept of bioinformation within the body in a in such a vivid manner. It became evident that on that evidence alone, there must be such a thing as bioplasma, and hence that there must be plasma bodies also. Presman said that every human body in the upright position was essentially an ellipsoid, a sort of elongated sphere, for purposes of analysis of currents and fields. Here are his drawings showing what he meant. Let's see here. Ellipsoid. Figure 33. The standing human body is largely composed of electrically conductive water and acts as an organic antenna, receiving waves and currents from outside and communicating them to the body's interior. It appears standing, and therefore as an ellipse for the purposes of Presman's whole body analyses and studies. And DNA is a fractal antenna. At left, the man is standing in a uniform electrical field, and the dotted lines show the direction of the induced current within the body. It's vertical, I guess. At right, a man is standing in a uniform magnetic field, and the dotted lines show the induced current circling within his body is at right angles and the magnetic field lines to the magnetic field lines. So electrical current goes this way, magnetic fields are perpendicular. So figure 16 from Prosman's book Electromagnetic Fields in Life, page 50, is where that comes from, I suppose. This figure, page 50. As we have already seen, electric fields and magnetic fields are always at right angles to one another. For instance, if a current is flowing along a wire, a magnetic field will be created in a circle surrounding it. In other words, it expands at right angles to the current. Presman says, quote, "The human body is a homogeneous in electrical properties homogeneous conducting ellipsoid," end quote. The major axis of the ellipse is the height of the person. Naturally, there are countless smaller minor currents and fields within the body, and this portrays the body only when treated as a whole and surrounded by an electrical field. Is there an end quote somewhere? Oh wait, the end quote was already over here. Anyways, shortly I am going to skim through the first portion of Presman's book and give extracts of Presman's comments stripped of their data and diagrams and equations so that you can enjoy some vivid glimpses of what he and his colleagues and predecessors had already discovered as early as 1968. Some of what you will read will possibly also horrify you. So, as they say, sometimes prior to television broadcasts, sensitive persons might wish to look away now. EMF stands for electromagnetic fields, quote unquote. In the introduction to his book, Presman calls attention to what his studies have forced upon him in order to make sense of his findings. Quote, This has given rise to the need for a fundamentally new theoretical approach to the problem of the biological activity of EMFs, a theory which will not only be consistent with the experimental data, but will provide a basis for their interpretation and an elucidation of the particular mechanisms involved. End quote. Or no, still going, quote. The application of this theory to biology has shown that, in addition to energetic interactions, informational interactions play a significant, if not the main, role in biological processes. Such interactions entail the conversion of information, its transmission, coding, and storage. The biological effects due to these interactions do not depend on the amount of energy introduced into the particular system, but on the amount of information introduced into it. The information carrying signal merely causes the redistribution of the energy of the system itself and regulates the processes occurring in it. If the sensitivity of the receiving systems is sufficiently high, very little energy is required for information transfer. It is a valid assumption that all these special features of the reactions of living organisms to EMFs are associated with certain biological systems formed in the process of evolution for the reception of information from the environment. This hypothesis has already received experimental verification. End quote. Information is concerned with tiny bits of information as much as vast amounts. For example, every electron that arrives as a signal is thus a new piece of information, a piece of information not previously possessed. Pressman extended what he stated above and said that information took precedence also in, quote, the regulation of physiological processes, end quote, within the body, and was crucial for, quote, informational connections between organisms, end quote, by which he means not just signaling between animals, but crucially communications between people, whether direct or by distant means. At this point, we should stop and think again about what is meant here by information, quote unquote. The word is not being used in the traditional sense of quote a collection of facts, quote unquote. Its use is the more modern and specialized one, prompted by information theory and relevant to what we now call IT, information technology. And that means that information, quote unquote, is being used not solely in the sense of passive information, which is only of use to conscious beings who receive it and make of it what they will, but in the sense of active information, which, when received, triggers an action of some kind, which, as in the example we saw earlier of the thermostat. When conceived of in this way, information, quote unquote, is another word for a signal, quote unquote, or taking it further as an activator, quote unquote, like pulling a switch. All hormones in the bloodstream convey information of this kind, as do our nerves when they sense that the fire is hot and trigger a response of our withdrawing our hands from the hot stove. Here, then, are some of the findings of Pressman extracted from his lengthy accounts, starting with some important information on the environment in which we live. Quote, in the Earth's atmosphere, there is an electric field, EE, in a direction normal to, at right angles to, the Earth's surface, so that this surface is negatively charged and the upper atmosphere is positively charged. The strength of this field depends on the geographical latitude. End quote. Pressman realized that he had to try to figure out more about how the body plasma worked and how it received and transmitted information. He made maps of the distribution of surface electrical potential over the body to help him understand what was going on. Here are his maps of the bodies of a lizard and a man. Okay, we got positive, positive, negatives around, negative around, positive in. Figure 34 Pressman's maps of the distribution of surface electric charge as it occurs on the body of a lizard and the body of a man from Electromagnetic Fields in Life, page 237, figure 93. Key points for the map are the brain and the spinal cord. Brain, spinal cord. Pressman's investigations led him to conclude that DNA molecules are generators of radio frequency signals and that RNA molecules, one of the four believed to be essential for all forms of life, with a role in coding and decoding genes, are amplifiers of those signals, whereas enzymes and amino acids are effectors of those coded signals. The cell wall he regarded as a noise filter. He believed that at a fundamental level, protein synthesis resulted from, quote, interactions within the organism and its interactions with environmental EMFs, end quote. In other words, electromagnetic fields carry information that activates molecules containing information, which in turn generates signals carrying information, which then trigger life processes within the body. I cannot emphasize enough that Pressman's reconceptualization of biology as orchestrated information flows could not be further from the purely chemical viewpoint. Excuse me. I am aware of how passionately and virulently many biologists hold to their exclusively chemical preconceptions. Through my years of friendship with Peter Mitchell, I heard from him so many times accounts of his 20-year struggle to overthrow what he called, quote, the bag of enzymes school of thought, end quote, in biology. Before Peter revolutionized the science, following in the footsteps of Pressman, biologists believed that the use of energy in the body was purely chemical. Cells were these bags of enzymes, quote unquote, that interacted purely by chemical diffusion. Peter was able to prove that current flows across membranes were what mattered, and that energy usage had structure and direction. In other words, it transmitted triggering information. And since, as I mentioned earlier, Peter believed that measurements of energy, quote unquote, are really records of transactions, his revolution that won him the Nobel Prize was in its underlying premises, surprisingly similar to Pressman's, though I do not think he had come across Pressman's work. For both Peter and Pressman, transactions are essentially information exchange. They viewed bodily signals as the transmission of information, and what Pressman concluded was going on. And what Pressman concluded was going on. Let me read this again. And what Pressman concluded was going on was information transmission and reception both within and without every organism by electromagnetic means. This brings us closer and closer to the true nature of our plasma selves. In working out the details of this, Pressman drew upon the ideas of the Austrian biologist Paul Alfred Weiss, 1898 to 1989, who in turn had drawn heavily upon the ideas of my old friend Joseph Needham, 1900 to 1993, with whom I collaborated on my book The Genius of China, and with whom I traveled to China in 1986, the only Western collaborator of his ever to do so. Weiss was famous for his lengthy book Principles of Development. Because of Weiss, Pressman was encouraged to ask, quote, why a free cell, which can extend in so many directions, often advances steadily in one direction to the exclusion of others, end quote, and, quote, how do cells recognize one another, end quote. It was clear to Pressman that these were consequences of information transmission within the body. He believed that this was because of, quote, of the existence of diverse interconnections within the living organisms by means of EMFs, end quote. And then, having arrived at this view, he turned to the work of Albert St. Georgi for help in figuring out how all of this happened. A summary of St. Georgi's ideas has already been given at length in chapter 14, but the key point here is that St. Georgi viewed the body electronically and insisted that it contained organic semiconductors that modulate and control the current flows and information signals. It was at this point that Pressman adopted the term bioinformation. He says, quote, signals transmitted in the animal world by methods of as yet unknown physical nature have recently been called bioinformation. There are grounds for believing that in several cases such signal transmission is affected by EMFs of various frequency ranges. This is borne out firstly by the high sensitivity of animals of the most diverse species to EMFs, and especially by the fact that EMFs can act as stimuli for the elaboration of conditioned reflexes. Secondly, it has been found that people exposed to EMFs experience various sensations, and that some animals have special EMF receptors. Thirdly, EMFs of various frequencies have been recorded in the vicinity of isolated organs and cells, as well as close to entire organisms, end quote. At this point, I must bring in the entirely separate work on these ideas of my old friend David Bohm, whose ideas we have already encountered in chapter 14, one of the most brilliant and original scientists of the 20th century, an American colleague and close friend of Einstein's when Einstein was in exile in America. David then went into exile himself. I first met David in London in 1982, and in that same year I published the first autobiographical account of him ever to appear in the New Scientist magazine. David was so shy. He had never been profiled before. It took me ages, assisted by his wonderful wife, Sarah, who to persuade him to let me take his photograph. Sarah realized that people found the correct spelling of her name confusing, so she often called herself Sarah Bohm. If it were not for her, David would never have survived his many years of bad health and the horrible stress, anxieties, persecution, penury, vilification, and despair that he went through during his lifetime as an exile, dragging himself from country to country trying to find somewhere to come to rest, which ended up being London. My wife and I later became very close to the Bohms and saw them many times. David was always desperately ill, and Sorel was afraid he would die at any moment of his terrible heart ailments. I never knew anyone to take as many pills every day as he did. He had a tea trolley entirely covered with boxes of different pills, and had to rootle through them to find the right ones, which he did while discussing quantum theory. As a young American scientist, David had been enjoying the prospects of an excellent academic career. Turned off. David had been enjoying the prospects of an excellent academic career at Princeton University, where he was a colleague of Albert Einstein, who admired David a great deal. During the war, David Bohm conducted research into plasma. When he saw the movement of particles in plasma, it struck him that they were behaving in concert in the way living creatures do. It seemed to him that there must be some underlying field or dimension that was interacting with these particles, resulting in life and a form of intelligence. This vision of intelligence in plasma became a paradigm for David Bohm as he developed a scientific and philosophical account of the universe that made him a senior figure in the second wave of theoretical physicists in the quantum revolution. In 1951, he published what many still consider the finest existing textbook on the standard interpretations of quantum theory. But then politics intervened. David's PhD supervisor had been Robert Oppenheimer, who came under political investigation by Congress for possibly being a communist. David was not himself a communist, although he was certainly very left-wing, and he did not want to be called before the Congressional Committee to testify against his former supervisor, so he fled America and settled in Brazil. That was the beginning of the rest of his life in exile, with some years spent also in Israel. He and his wife were both that, um, though non-practicing. It was David Bohm who moved the concept of information, quote unquote, to forward into a whole new dimension. From the 1980s until his death on 27th of October 1992. 10/27, 1992. David continued to elaborate the most revolutionary ideas on this subject. As we have seen, Pressman was concerned with biology and biophysics, whereas David was concerned with physics and mind. The key to David's innovation, is in his own elaborate and individual concept of active information. Earlier, I spoke generally of passive and active information, but that was from my own limited point of view, based upon what seemed to me common sense. It is now time to see what a real scientific genius does when he gets his hands on the idea of active information. Let us start with this startling remark by David's protege in this particular field, the Finnish philosopher of science, Paavo Pilkkanen, apologies. He says that, according to David Bohm, quote, not only the behavior, but also the very being of particles are based on the activity of information, end quote. This is a very big claim. It puts active information at the heart of everything. David's alternative interpretation of quantum theory is often famously known as the causal interpretation. In the classic formation of quantum mechanics, the interactions of waves and particles have uncertain outcomes. The position and other qualities of particles can therefore only be expressed in terms of probability rather than of certainty. It was thought in the standard view that this will always and inevitably be the case. because it reflects the way the universe is made. Albert Einstein was skeptical of this, and so was David Bohm. In his information, in his formulation rather, cause and effect holds true in the quantum world as it does in the macro or everyday world, but we cannot calculate results with certainty because we don't have all the information. There are hidden variables, quote unquote, and he saw these as being hidden in the information contained in the waves as the form of a signal. He stressed that form, having very little energy, enters into and directs a much greater energy. It puts form into it, i.e., it informs it. Hence, information. In other words, uncertainty is not a quality of the physical universe. It only arises because we don't have enough information. David Bohm's interpretation of quantum mechanics based upon what he called hidden variables, quote unquote, is perfectly valid in terms of all experimental results. And the difference between it and the standard view is a difference in interpretation. His he first published it in January of 1952 in a series of two papers in the Physical Review. Those papers had a big impact on Louis de Broglie, 1892 to 1987, Nobel Prize for Physics, 1929, in France, as a result of which de Broglie was also abandoned the standard quote unquote interpretation of quantum mechanics with tremendous repercussions in the world physics community, and which greatly added to David's scientific status. So David's focus on information as the driving force at the heart of the universe helped throw a startling new light on the central problem of quantum mechanics, which has been a matter of debate and generated a spectrum of views over the last 100 years. To explore further the mind-bending ideas of David Bohm, it is helpful to start by contemplating how a small energy charge can, by the transmission of information, trigger whole-scale changes in an entity with much larger energies. Here are some comments he made in a 1987 book. Quote, the basic idea of active information is that a form having very little energy enters into and directs a much greater energy. This notion of an original energy acting to inform, quote unquote, or put form into a much larger energy has significant applications in many areas beyond quantum theory. Consider a radio wave whose form carries a signal, the voice of an announcer, for example. The energy of the sound that is heard from the radio does not, in fact, come from this wave, but from the batteries or the power plug. This latter energy is especially unformed, quote unquote, but takes up its form from the information within the radio wave. This information is potentially active everywhere, but only actually active when it forms when its form enters into the electrical energy of the radio. The analogy with the causal interpretation of quantum mechanics is clear. A quantum wave carries information, quote unquote, and is therefore potentially active everywhere, but it is actually active only when and where this energy enters into the energy of the particle. But this implies that an electron or any other elementary particle has a complex and subtle inner structure that is at least comparable with that of a radio. Nature may be far more subtle and strange than was previously thought. End quote. A lot of the force of his thinking comes from his focus on what we don't know rather than what we do. He uses his colossal mathematical and scientific imagination to map new territories. Here, David is saying that events in the universe, including at the quantum level, unfold in the way they do because of an exchange of information between fields and particles that may contain a lot of information and mechanisms, which at the moment we have little idea about. In fact, we can scarcely begin to dream about them. In 1979, the 20-year-old Finnish undergraduate student at the University of Uppsala in Sweden named Paavo Pekkanen, quoted above, became interested in David Bohm's ideas. The following year, he was able to meet him at a conference in England. Throughout the early 1980s, Pekkanen encountered David at other conferences, and then in 1984 to 1985, when he commenced a master's thesis at the University of Sussex, he was able to meet and discuss David's ideas with him in greater detail. In 1988, Pekkanen commenced a PhD course at the University of Helsinki, with the subject being David's interpretation of quantum mechanics and its potential importance for cognitive science, that is, how we think. In 1990, with grants from Finland, he was able to become an academic visitor, quote unquote, at both Oxford and David's own Birkbeck College of the University of London. This made it possible for him to have plenty of conversations with David and with David's closest collaborator and academic friend, Basil Hiley, who was also at Birkbeck. This period coincided with David's publication in 1990 of a brief but essentially final version of his ideas about how his version of quantum theory related to the functioning of the human mind. Pekkanen was thus very much in the right place at the right time. In July of 1992, Pekkanen completed his thesis and submitted it to the University of Helsinki only 3 months before David's death. If David had lived longer, they would probably have written a book together. Pekkanen's thesis was published in 1992 by the University of Helsinki. His abstract at the beginning of the book commences like this, quote, the first aim of this study is to analyze, evaluate, and extend David Bohm's 1990 theory of the relation of mind and matter, based on his ontological interpretation of quantum theory. Note, ontology is a branch of metaphysics dealing with the nature of being. In Bohm's interpretation, uncertainty arises as a problem of perception, not a problem with the nature of reality or being. The second aim is to consider the relevance of this theory to the philosophy of cognitive science. This interpretation postulates that elementary particles are guided by a field containing active information. Bohm suggests that in certain key ways, the activity of information at the quantum level is similar to the activity of information in ordinary human subjective experiences, and he uses this similarity as a basis for his mind-matter theory. End quote. Well, what Pekkanen is pointing to here is that Bohm sees some of the bizarre behavior described in quantum mechanics in the common human experience of consciousness. This is important for the main theme of this book because, as we have already noted, human brains, like quantum computers, contain complex plasma, and plasma may be a medium by which uncertain and bizarre quantum phenomena enter the human experience. In 2006, Pekkanen published an ambitious book entitled Mind, Matter, and the Implicate Order. The implicate order, quote unquote, is the phrase that had been used by Bohm for decades to describe aspects of his evolving theories to do with the self-ordering qualities of the universe, analogous in some ways to Prigoghine's ideas of dissipation, which we looked at in Chapter 3. This book carries forward all his thoughts on David's ideas, and his preface commences like this, quote, I have been planning to write a book ever since I finished my PhD dissertation in 1992. For various reasons, it has taken me a long time to do this. I started writing notes in February of 2000. This book deals with topics that have been variously neglected and even forbidden, quote unquote, in academic circles during much of the 20th century. One such issue is conscious experience, the study of which was famously suppressed in behaviorist psychology and even in traditional cognitive science, and has only recently become the focus of intense research in a number of fields. Yet another traditionally forbidden quote unquote topic has to be discussed in this book is connected with physics and has to do with the interpretation of quantum theory. To some extent, the suppression of this discussion about the meaning of quantum theory is connected with the above-mentioned suppression of metaphysics in general. For quantum theory was initially interpreted in the 1920s in the strongly anti-metaphysical climate of logical positivism, making it forbidden, quote unquote, to try to sketch the nature of reality at the quantum level. I have chosen in this book to focus strongly upon David Bohm's views, for it seems to me that Bohm was one of the few 20th century thinkers who had a good grasp not only quantum physics, which was his original field of expertise and which he indeed helped to develop, but also the natural sciences more generally, as well as philosophy and consciousness. He saw the importance of trying to understand the connections between these areas and was indeed developing a new big picture, quote unquote. End quote. Pilkkonen is thus very much the heir to David's ideas linking quantum theory with the workings of the human mind. And again, central to those ideas is David's concept of active information. Let us get down to greater detail of what the active information theory of David Bohm really suggests in relation to quantum mechanics and why it is vital for the purposes of this book. Pilkkonen says that David and his colleague Basil Hiley in a joint publication had made, quote, a radical suggestion. The quantum field contains something at least analogous to information. Remember that this is information for the electron, not information for us. Information is seen as an objective aspect of reality, and it is thought to be generally active. The first reason to postulate active information at the quantum level is that the effect of the quantum field upon the particle field depends only on the form of the field, the information encoded within it, not upon its amplitude. Amplitude for a wave is the height of the wave in one ripple from the bottom to top of the wave, which scientists ponderously call, quote, a measure of its change over a single period, end quote. The form of the field informs, that is, directs the particle by means of the information it provides, the energy and movement of the particle. This is analogous to the way the form of the radar wave informs the energy and movement of a ship on automatic pilot, the way the form of the DNA informs the activities in a cell, and the way the form of a shadow in a dark night can give form to the psychological state of a person who perceives and interprets it by getting scared. End quote. In other words, David Bohm is arguing that there is crucial information hidden not only in individual particles, but also in fields, and that the entire universe is triggered by the interaction between them. To put it another way, a particle such as an electron contains a lot of information, some of which is triggered into action when the particle interacts with an underlying field. Of course, scientists already knew that the behavior of particles is changed by interactions with underlying fields, but Bohm's supreme mathematical imagination enabled him to suppose that large amounts of information in a simple seeming particle might interact not only with fields we already know about, but also with another as yet unknown field, another dimension, something that might even be a cosmic intelligence beneath the fields we know about and ordering them. He called this the implicate order, and he believed and described in the language of science how the explicate order, the universe we see and experience with our senses, can unfold out of the implicate one. He understood this unfolding process to work like a hologram, a way of looking at the universe he shared with his friend and colleague Carl Pribram, whose work we touched on earlier. A hologram is a record of what an object looks like at every angle. In technology, we are all familiar with holograms on banknotes and credit cards. They are made up of light beams, which have been organized to act in concert and deflect off the object that is to be depicted in order to generate information on what it looks like. The same pattern of beams can then be reproduced to create a 3D image of the object even when it isn't there. An important part of this analogy of our purposes for our purposes is that if you break a hologram into bits, each bit will contain an image of the entire object. What David Bohm is saying is not only that the entire universe is a hologram in the sense of being an unfolding of an intelligent implicate order, quote unquote, that underlies everything, but that this driving ordering process is equally present everywhere in the universe. It underlies our intelligence, the intelligence we see in animals and plants, and the intelligence we saw in the movements of plasma near the start of his scientific journey, which we are now beginning to understand. David's focus on the information rather than the energy that fields transmit by means of their form brings us to the subject of the work of Rupert Sheldrake. I first met Rupert in 1981, and he and I have been friends now for 4 decades, as well as my wife Olivia and myself also being family friends of the Sheldrakes. We knew Rupert's wife, Jill Peirce, for more than a decade before we knew him, and their 2 sons are just as much our friends as their parents are. Rupert and I both knew David Bohm from the early 1980s, but we did not mention it to each other during David's lifetime, and only discovered it later. Well, that's a shame. Rupert and David were very active together in helping one another with their respective ideas during the years they knew each other, and they took part in conferences together, none of which I attended, alas, as I was very distracted during that period with my work on the history of Chinese science as a colleague of Joseph Needham. Rupert has published so many books and papers that he is widely known, and it would be impertinent of me to try to summarize his brilliant findings in the field that he calls morphic resonance, which is based upon form fields, quote unquote. Rupert's background was as a biologist, not a physicist, and he has told me that he does not go in for attempting to formulate physics theories. He had hoped that David Bohm could provide the physics basis to explain morphic resonance, but David was unable to do so, despite the goodwill between them. There is no doubt in my mind that Rupert's work on the transmission of form by morphic fields, quote unquote, is connected somehow with Bohm's transmission of form by, quote, the form of the field, end quote, as mentioned a moment ago. And both are involved in the communication of information as form. Rupert's, Rupert's book, The Science Delusion, known in American as Science Set Free 2012, is a brilliant analysis of what is wrong with mainstream quote-unquote science, as the ultra-conservatives of science like to call themselves. I'm very tempted to read that book, do a read-through of that book soon. Uh, an interesting description of the invisible soul was given by the French philosopher René Descartes, 1596 to 1650, who called it una chose qui pense, Latin probably, I'm butchering that one, which the English philosopher of science Joseph Glanville, 1636 to 1680, translated as, quote, a thinking substance, end quote. This excellent turn of phrase from the 17th century is well worth hanging on to. For if I were to find one phrase that I believe sums up the nature of our plasma bodies, as well as the Kordylewski clouds themselves, it would be to say that those information-laden entities must truly be a thinking substance, end quote. There's no quote. If all entities are essentially plasma entities that form time to time, become physical, quote unquote, or become embodied in atomic matter, quote unquote, then the thinking substance of each entity will have certain information requirements for survival, and these will vary considerably. There are two extreme cases one can mention. The first is moths, which have the ability to detect a single molecule in the air and trace it back to its flower. A more familiar example is to be found in predatory birds such as hawks and falcons. The fantastic eyesight of these birds enables them to spot tiny rodents such as mice from extreme altitudes, upon which they then suddenly swoop. The visual acuity of these birds is nature's rival to modern military satellites, which we are anecdotally informed, and it may even be true, can read a car license plate from several miles above us. All of these phenomena display the extremes of information capture, and sometimes information capture can occur by paranormal means without even trying, when the desperation of the situation is sufficiently intense. I shall give one example from my own life. During my time as a consultant at board level to the telecoms company, Cable and Wireless, my wife Olivia and I and our aged dog Kim, a border collie, shared an office at C&W. Kim lay on her silk eiderdown, and at Olivia's feet beneath her desk. Animals are supposed to be banned from entry in C&W buildings, and Kim was the only canine intruder who ever evaded this prohibition. But one day, a grumpy executive made an official complaint about there being a dog in the lift with him. The matter was judged to be so serious that it was entered onto the agenda of the next board meeting of the directors of Cable and Wireless. Yes, this is true. The director with whom I was associated was Jonathan Solomon, who, unknown to the other directors, had written a book about his dog who had died, but whom he had loved beyond all measure. When they reached the item on the agenda where the fate of Kim was to be discussed, Jonathan made an impassioned speech on the board that doggies are important, quote unquote, to quote his own words. and the board agreed to permit Kim privileged entry to the building as a result. This matter of great weight and importance, treated at the same level as corporate acquisitions in Asia and the Caribbean, enabled Kim to remain at Olivia's feet, which was all Kim desired. We at the time had the entire top floor of an office building to ourselves, where we played bulls and Kim chased balls. That floor now holds. It said conked out. Let's restart here. That floor now holds the executive office of Len McCluskey, the head of the Unite Union, who is doubtless too busy to play bowls. One day we had to use a small closed room protected by a door code, and Kim came with us, as her advice was already needed. Was always needed. The door had been opened for us and the person had left. Olivia and I left the room briefly for some reason, and the door closed behind us, leaving Kim locked in the room. Kim, by then, had very serious kidney issues and needed to drink lots of water, and her bowl was dry. We were told the only person with the door code might not be back until the next day. We knew that Kim could not live that long without water. No one was prepared to arrange for the door to be forced. In a moment of intense emotion about the fate of our precious Kim, I forced myself to know, quote unquote, the door code, which came into my mind in some manner unknown. I punched it in and the door opened and we were able to save Kim. This is an example of personal experience of the accessibility of information when truly needed, from a world that is probably entirely constituted of information. As this ball as this book draws near to its close, I want to mention a peculiarity about himself recorded in his autobiography by Nikola Tesla. He records this, quote, "In my boyhood, I suffered from a peculiar affliction due to the appearance of images, often accompanied by strange, strong flashes of light, which marred the sight of real objects and interfered with my thought and action. I was about 12 years old when I first succeeded in banishing an image from my vision by willful effort, but I never had any control over the flashes of light to which I have referred. They were perhaps my strangest experience and inexplicable. They usually occurred when I found myself in a dangerous or distressing situation, or when I was greatly exhilarated. In some instances, I have seen all the air around me filled with tongues of living flame. Their intensity, instead of diminishing, increased with time and seemingly attained a maximum when I was about 25 years old. While in Paris in 1883, excuse me, sheesh, a prominent French manufacturer sent me an invitation to a shooting expedition, which I accepted. I had been long confined to the factory, and the fresh air had a wonderfully invigorating effect on me. On my return to the city that night, I felt a positive sensation that my brain had caught fire. I saw a light as though a small sun was located in it, and I passed the whole night applying cold compressions to my tortured head. Finally, the flashes diminished in frequency and force, but it took more than 3 weeks before they wholly subsided. These luminous phenomena still manifest themselves from time to time, as when a new idea opening up possibilities strikes me, end quote. That is, he was definitely someone ahead of his time. I can see why Temple would mention this, as it seems to be pretty apropos to light being information and Tesla experiencing it the way he did. It seems to be the case anyway. I don't know if you could say that's how it exactly took place, mechanically, scientifically. There might be other things involved, I'm sure. Here we find extraordinarily frank descriptions by Tesla of his being tormented over the years by what appeared to be the visualization and perception of his own plasma body. Our plasma bodies would necessarily be like tongues of living flame, quote unquote, surrounding us, because that is what plasma is like. By flames, we should not, however, imagine flames producing heat, as with the flames of a physical fire. Notice that Tesla speaks of living flame, quote unquote, suggesting that he could see pulsations or waves within the flames, so that they appeared as if they were dynamic and alive, quote unquote, in some sense. He could this in a sense could be what happened at Pentecost with the disciples turned apostles, allegedly. What's it say in Acts? Tongues of flame or tongues of fire descended upon them. So that's interesting. It is interesting that he sensed a small sun, quote unquote, within his brain. The interaction between a plasma body and a physical body would be expected to involve a node of concentrated plasma somewhere within the brain. I cannot resist the impression that Tesla experienced phenomena caused by his physical body being insufficiently insulated from his plasma body, so that he was tormented by overexposure to it. But that, of course, may explain his amazing mental powers of visualization, invention, and inspiration. In other words, perhaps great geniuses have an increased access to their plasma cells. Certainly, physics are always complaining. Physics, you mean physicists, are always complaining of the agonies they suffer from their paranormal perceptions. Physical suffering thus seems to go with plasmic phenomena, quote unquote, invading the physical. This is not at all surprising because of the higher energies involved. This could explain feeling, quote, a positive sensation that my brain had caught fire, end quote. It may well be that many of the great geniuses whose stories we have told in this history had a particularly intense relationship with their plasma bodies, and that this is what made them visionaries. To return to the Kordylewski clouds, Benjamin Schumacher and a colleague named Michael Westmoreland published an important book in 2010 entitled Quantum Processes, Systems, and Information. They attempt to define information at the beginning of that book like this, quote, information is the ability to distinguish reliably between possible alternatives, end quote. As their book moves along, they refine this definition, a journey too detailed for us to follow here. But I would not like people to think this initial statement is where they stop. Rather, it is where they begin. The authors elucidate information processing at the nanometer scale, and as we will recall, the charge charged dust particles largely constituting the Kordylewski clouds are nano-sized. Second, they discuss the complexity of systems needed to generate intelligence, which resonates well with the description by the eminent astrophysicist Rick Ramasinghe and myself outlined in Chapter 12. Summarizing their findings, they say, quote, "We have demonstrated the connection between a complex hierarchical structure and the complex dynamics of the system. The number of hierarchical levels of the system, in our case 5, is a measure for the homogeneous, quote unquote, complexity of the system. The minimum number of hierarchical levels is a prerequisite in order to realize multi-stability, preparation, measurement, and control necessary to achieve a complex dynamics which is equivalent to information processing." End quote. Several experts in the new physics of information have made timely comments which may make claims that everything is essentially information seem less shocking. In 1990, an expert in this field named Wojciech H. Zurich being a favorite Polish soup of mine, as well as a common Polish surname, edited a volume of proceedings of an important conference held the year before. He prefaced it with the sentence, quote, "The specter of information is haunting science," end quote. Two joint contributors to the Zurich volume was Werner G. Teach, Take, Teach, and Günther Mahler. They gave special attention to, quote, information processing systems where the basic elements have a dimension of a few nanometers and possible realizations in form of semiconductor heterostructures, quantum dots, quote unquote, as well, end quote. They say that their research might be described as molecular electronics. We may be forgiven for feeling a sense of deja vu here, because this takes us back to our old friend Albert St. Georgi, who was discussed at length in Chapter 14, and his, you remember correctly, molecular electronics first discussed in a book of his as early as 1950, 41 years before Teach and Mahler's paper was delivered. One more paper in the Zurich volume is important for us as well, namely that by Seth Lloyd, who I gather from Google nowadays quaintly describes himself as, quote, a quantum mechanic, end quote. It is good to know that he can repair nano-sized carburetors and change the spark plugs inside electronic molecules. But what I like most about him is his paper Valuable Information. In the Zurich volume, he begins to tell us about the birds and the bees, but in fact, the bees are enough. Quote, "Information is the currency of nature. A bee carries genetic information contained in pollen to a flower, which in turn supplies the bee with ordered energy in the form of sugar, a transaction that redounds to their mutual advantage. A drop of sugar sitting by a pistil in a flower registers an amount of information equal to the free energy of the drop divided by the ambient temperature. The drop's information is proportional to its calorie content. When the bee gets sugar water in return for DNA, she is getting a very good deal in food value. Pollen is low-calorie stuff, but the flower is not getting the worst of the bargain. Although the DNA uh, although the DNA the flower gains is a diet item compared with the sugar water given up, the information that it contains is of high quality, refined by natural selection through generations, and essential to the flower's ability to reproduce. As a result, the flower places a higher value on the small amount of information in the pollen than on the large amount of information in the sugar. Value depends not only on the amount of information, but on how difficult that information was to produce. Down the years, far greater resources have into producing flower DNA than the sunlight and soil that went into making today's drop of sugar water. A process such as evolution consists of many interactions and exchanges of information, and the genetic makeup of a species contains, in edited form, the information about past interactions between species and environment. Genetic information registers experience. End quote. The scientists concerned with this information theory stress the need for multiple hierarchies of information. The Kordylewski clouds are capable of intelligence because they are not just simple plasmas, but are dusty complex plasmas. Their interiors are so complex that they can have a number of hierarchical levels limited only by the size of the cloud. And since the clouds are so gigantic, there could be many millions or even billions of hierarchical levels inside them. Earlier, we talked about voids in complex dusty plasma, such as the Kordylewski clouds, and their role in separating out different organs, quote unquote, with distinct functions within the living entity. I want to mention here some revolutionary work on voids, which suggests that voids may have other, more mysterious functions. In my earlier book, Netherworld, known in the USA in a new title bestowed by the publisher there as Oracles of the Dead. How, how very enticing, right? I discussed at very great length the importance of voids, stressing that the founding father of void studies was the crystal, crystal, crystallogra- crystallographer, crystallographer Victor Goldschmidt. It was he who identified the crucial importance of voids in otherwise solid quote unquote physical matter. He described that there was such a thing as systematic and highly geometrical void formation in crystals. The voids were very carefully and meticulously formed and were not at all random. He called these carefully crafted voids dissolution forms, quote unquote. When a dissolution form reaches complete emptiness, it is called the end body. These voids were found to form void lattices, quote unquote, which were the empty, quote unquote, equivalents of solid lattices, as I summarize it, quote. In other words, with the end body, one reaches the final form of the void lattice, and further action by the solvent merely reduces it in size, but no longer alters its conformation. One has attained the pure void form, and we call or we could call it the substance lattice, traced and outlined by some remaining residues of matter, and which is the yin corresponding to the yang of the material shape. End quote. I cannot repeat here the discussion of void lattices and their crucial importance in both metallurgy and in geology, nor can I elaborate further on Goldschmidt's revolutionary work. But these voids and void lattices are so important in general because they are manifestations of renewal. They are the destruction lattices that empty themselves of matter so that the new can be made. As the creation lattices exhaust themselves and come to the ends of their useful lives. In other words, forms grow and die and are replaced anew from form from formed emptiness that has grown geometrically and sits waiting to be filled. One is the summer and the other and one is the summer and one is the winter, and rebirth takes place from ordered death in an endless process of birth, death, replacement, and renewal. Without the formation of voids, this cycle cannot happen. And this is possibly how we get reincarnation or rebirth, as he says, rebirth. Possibly, anyway. I don't know for sure. Seems like that would be the way that it happens, though. Since voids form in matter, and plasma is made of matter, not just atomic matter, we can expect that plasma clouds will be riddled with voids. This would certainly apply to the Kordylewski clouds. These voids would serve the function of assisting in the continual regeneration of the clouds by replacing exhausted lattices in the plasma crystals and renewing the crystals in an endless progression. Indeed, I wonder if the people working on fusion reactors have ever given any thought to facilitating void formation in their plasmas, which might help in their frustrating search that has already lasted many decades for a fusion reactor that works. They won't get anywhere in a uniform plasma. They have to create voids. Presumably pulsations and harmonic resonance could be employed. The other thing, which I mentioned in chapter 3, is the need for spaces between things, and voids clearly contribute to that. Empty spaces are needed in any large entity. Something that is completely full cannot work. There always has to be some flexibility. No period for some reason. Typo. The first observation of a void within plasma appears to have taken place in a laboratory in 1996, as reported by G. Prabhuram and John A. Gorey. By 1999, several papers appeared that had studied these plasma dust voids. One by Vadim Saitovich, Sergei Vladimirov, and Gregor Morfill proved that the size of the void depends upon the power input into the plasma, and that the greater the power, the larger the void. Gorey and Dmitry Samsonov followed with their own paper that year, as did Gregor Morfill, Hubertus Thomas, and other leading scientists. So one could say that 1999 was, quote, the year of the plasma void, end quote. Subsequent research was relentless after that, and essentially came to a climax under the direction of the brilliant Japanese scientist Osamu Isahara, or Osamu Isahara, who published who published the above figure. In this paper, written jointly by Isahara and with his colleague Noriyoshi Sato, they said, quote, a void structure characterized by a dust-free ordered state with a sharp boundary in a dusty plasma was observed in microgravity conditions in space orbit, as well as in ground-based laboratory plasmas. Voids have been observed not only in a complex plasma, but also in colloidal suspensions. In conclusion, the electrostatic attractive force between like charges in a complex plasma, where charged macroparticles where charged macroparticles are embedded in a fully ionized plasma, is shown to be responsible for the sharp boundary formation associated with a void, end quote. It is interesting to examine how all of this research came to be carried out, especially in light of these comments made by Isahara in 2008. Quote, Professor Oleg Petrov and Dr. Sergei Antipov of Joint Institute for High Temperatures of the Russian Academy of Sciences, former Institute of High Energy Densities, Russian Academy of Sciences, Moscow, Russia, visited our lab in Japan from December 22nd to the 23rd of 2007. We exchanged the detailed information on the experiments of cryogenic complex plasma experiments. We are the only two groups in the world to carry on the cryogenic complex plasma experiments. End quote. Another important development is the report published in August of 2021 in Nature that at last a material has been discovered that is a natural, quote, topological superfluid, end quote. The implications of this are enormous, and an entire new area has now opened up that relates to our concerns. If only it were possible to discuss this further. But these matters go way beyond what we have space to consider here. In the final chapter, we will bring together the arguments to show that plasma in space may well have evolved intelligence billions of years before the evolution of humans. That's the end of chapter 17. Let's see. We could probably do this. Yeah. Chapter 18, Wrapping Up the Universe. As we wrap up the universe, we will consider how parts of the universe seem to be self-organizing, how complex structures emerge, and how the way things slow down and fall apart. The second law of thermodynamics is by no means the whole story. Highly unstable charged entities such as dusty plasmas throw out dissipative structures over vast distances. In other words, leading scientists have been looking at the way that there are fundamental tendencies in the universe toward greater and greater complexity, towards the higher levels of complexity necessary for intelligence. In trying to understand how human consciousness and intelligence works, classical science has tended to concentrate on chemical reactions in the brain. In the second half of the 20th century, many leading scientists shifted the focus to an interaction between matter and subatomic matter in the brain and external fields such as electromagnetic fields. It is well established, for example, that birds follow migratory paths by interacting with the Earth's magnetic fields. Could this be one small example of a universal phenomenon? It is also well established that artificial electromagnetic fields from phone masts can have a deleterious effect on human health and behavior. But could natural electromagnetic electromagnetism on the Earth and more widely in the cosmos have a much more fundamental, indeed essential role in forming and informing animal and human minds? Plasma's unique sensitivity to fields would seem to make it uniquely suited to this kind of interaction. And we have already begun to question whether there is plasma in the brain. Similarly, in recent times, the creation of artificial intelligence and quantum computers have helped prompt new perspectives on human intelligence and mind in two main ways. AI tends to see intelligence in terms of the transmission and processing of information. When it comes to understanding and defining human intelligence, this leads naturally to a focus on the flow of information rather than the flow of chemical and biological processes, information theory. Unlike traditional digital computers, which work by considering simple either-or options, albeit an immense accumulation of them, the bigger the accumulation, the more powerful the computer. The new quantum computers work much more powerfully. indeed on a whole different level because they are able to consider many more options than a simple either or at any one time, and indeed make multiple considerations such as these simultaneously. It seems not to have been recognized yet that this operates by means of what I call information void creation, quote unquote. When one alternative is chosen over another, it creates an information void in the form of the rejected alternative. However, that void can be filled again by shifting one's choice to that alternative. With multiple choices taking place, the traditional one and zero, quote unquote, of normal computing can be replaced by empty and full, quote unquote, as concepts with shifting but parallel geometries of information. Out again. Parallel geometries of information lattices and information void lattices side by side. Continuous changing the dynamics of these parallel lattices being plotted and manipulated by non-linear linear equations. This can be studied in reduced form by plotting the mechanisms of memory retrieval. This may sound simplistic, but it is actually the best basis for the construction of a geometry of alternatives in the theory of quantum computing. Someone needs to mathematize this, mathematize it. And in this way, and in this, they are, of course, typo, very like the human mind. What makes the development of these new quantum computers work is the way they use plasma. So again, we come back to this new way of trying to understand human intelligence and consciousness. Could it be that plasma in the human brain, the human body, has played a vital role in its evolution? We have seen a great deal of information and learned the life stories of some of the great heroes of science who have brought us this far, despite the fact that many of them were called crazy before they won their Nobel Prizes. Let us now try to bring together a summary of what all of this means. The first and most important thing is what I have stressed since the very beginning of this book, namely that physical matter is very rare in the universe and is not the predominant component of what exists. The obvious conclusion is that if the universe is full of life forms, including intelligent ones, the majority of them will not be made of physical matter. They will instead be made of plasma, and that may include us. I am suggesting that we are all made of plasma and that our physical bodies are temporary vehicles for us to operate in the physical world for the short periods of time that our fragile bodies can permit, considering how quickly they wear out, how prone they are to accidents, and how vulnerable they are to disease. But that has been made amply clear at an earlier stage of this book. What we need to do here is to explore more thoroughly how living entities can come to be in a plasma universe. We are so used to being immersed in a world of physical matter that it is a great struggle for us to free ourselves from the encumbrances of stuff. Stuff, quote unquote, is a wonderful word used mostly in America to refer to anything that encumbers one or gets in the way. On the other hand, stuff, quote unquote, can sometimes be useful because it is stuff, quote unquote, has no actual definition that it can be used so readily as an idea. So let us free ourselves from our physical stuff, quote unquote, and let our minds roam free. It is unavoidable to conclude that if the universe is made of 99%, not 0.9% plasma, then life forms in it must also be 99% made of plasma. So we need to understand such life forms urgently. It is indeed difficult for us being what we are, or should I say, being what we think we are, to imagine that a diffuse charged dusty plasma could possibly be a living thing or a living being. But what if you but what if you were such a cloud and saw us? You might think, quote, what thick, clumsy, awkward objects those things are that move about upon the earth. I wonder if they could possibly contain any elements of life in them. They may simply be moving lumps of protoplasm with four protrusions sticking out like viruses have. And anyone knows that viruses are not alive. End quote. Lols. Sad trombone. Everything depends upon dust. This sounds so inglorious that it is difficult to grasp because we are used to thinking of house dust and the need to clean the house, and also, in my case, to dust my books. Uh, but in order to, but in order for a plasma to come alive, it needs dust. It gives the particles something to cling to. 10,000 electrons can cling to a single dust particle. So when you consider how many dust particles there are in a dusty plasma cloud, and if you can imagine 10,000 electrons attached to each one, giving each dust particle the electric charge of 10,000 electrons, gigantic electric charges beyond any power station or power network on Earth can gather in a single cloud. The huge electromagnetic forces of the clouds are inconceivable to our tiny little minds, and even the bravest equation trembles at the thought of the number of exponents appearing in it, each one carrying so many zeros, it is enough to make a person faint. So we get it, things are different in space. One key to all these clouds coming alive is also in the supply of ready food. For plasma entities, that means a reliable flow of particles. Plasma clouds eat particles in the way that whales eat plankton. Please note that whales are the largest mammals on Earth, but they eat the smallest food. Plasma clouds may be huge, but they too can eat their own space plankton, quote unquote, namely large charged particles and ions. It so happens that suns and stars are, as the English say, just the ticket, quote unquote, for they are spewing out particles continuously, and one aspect of this has been known for a very long time. I am referring to sunlight as the source of energy for plants. If plants can eat sunlight, then why can't plasma clouds do so too? Of course, I am not suggesting chlorophyll in plasma clouds. I am suggesting the absorption of energy from the particles consisting of the solar wind. The huge electromagnetic forces in the charged clouds are so much more powerful than gravity that they suffice to hold everything together, even if the cloud is extremely diffuse. We must never forget that electromagnetic forces are more powerful than gravitational ones by a factor of 10 followed by 39 zeros. We should therefore never underestimate the power of electromagnetism to hold things together, a perpetual embrace. Now we can see that it is not difficult to conceive of these large charged dusty plasma clouds becoming things. How do they become living things? We have examined the anatomy of complex dusty plasma. At this point, I would like to refer to the reader back to what I wrote in chapter 12 about how the electromagnetic strength, quote unquote, of the Kordylewski clouds could arise, which holds them together. I explained how spinning dust grains can, like incredibly small rice grains, which range in size between a micrometer, which is 1 millionth of a meter, and a nanometer, which is 1,000 times smaller than that, each with a north pole and a south pole, can collectively, by their spinning, generate gigantic amounts of energy. They are like billions upon billions of microscopic power generators, and it is these that generate the energy which creates the structure and internal organization of the cloud. We have seen they do in fact become filled with crystalline structures like the structures in organic life, double helixes capable of storing information, filaments to conduct currents like nerves in animal bodies, semiconductors capable of acting as Josephson junctions. In the same way, these things work in animal bodies, voids that separate different organs, enabling them to perform different functions within an overarching system, as our organs do in our bodies. You can have a hot pocket next to a cold pocket, and they will not disturb one another. Much of the cloud in space needs to contain superconductive currents, and that is easier at low temperatures in what is called a cold plasma. But because of sheaths, you can have all that going on at cold temperatures, while at the same time having internal sheath pockets and currents operating at extremely high temperatures. We have also seen that voids have regenerative capacities. We have seen that these plasmas contain seething patterns of interacting fields and currents and that these are driven to very high levels of complexity by interactions with complex dust within. There may be as yet barely understood particles involved in this drive to create complex patterns such as magnetic monopoles and tachyons. We have looked at various theories to explain how the drive to complexity arises in the universe as whole, and which may be pertinent to the evolution of life in plasma. We looked at Prigoghine's theories of dissipative structures. There are theories of emergence and self-organization, which describe how complex things grow spontaneously and unpredictably, so they become greater than the sum of their parts. And we looked at David Bohm's theory of the implicate order, of an ordering faculty that lies beneath the universal fields we know about. That sounds kind of like the logos. How might complex dusty plasmas be intelligent like plants, humans, or quantum computers are intelligent? The light that information throws on the nature of intelligence shows that plant life can be extremely intelligent and that plasmas may be intelligent in the same way. Plasmas compete for food, so there may also be a survival of the fittest factor driving their evolution. Like intelligent entities, plasmas may cooperate as well as compete, so that long-range order events may involve not only communication but cooperation in the process of achieving the complexity necessary for intelligence. We have seen that ball lightning, which is made of plasma, often behaves in an intelligent manner. We have seen that the role plasma plays in helping our own intelligence to evolve and function at high levels may also play out in plasmas in space, and that conditions may have been right for this billions of years before conditions became right for the evolution of life on Earth. I am also suggesting that the predominant forms of life in the universe are inorganic. The organic life forms of our planet are a footnote, not the main text of the message of the universe. Just as information theory and the invention of digital computers caused us to reassess the nature and potential of intelligence, so too the development of quantum computers has opened up new horizons. Quantum computers contain plasma to help harvest the weird phenomena of the quantum realm in order to generate intelligence far greater than any digital computer. Complex plasmas also have these properties. We have seen ball lightning move through solid objects, which is an example of phenomenon of quantum tunneling happening in the macro world. We have seen gigantic filaments made of plasma carrying superconducting currents through with energy and information. We have seen that these plasmas contain elements that work like Josephson junctions used to control and fine-tune the flow of energies and information in machine intelligence. So they may have intelligence we can hardly begin to imagine. But we have also seen that our bodies have many of the plasma features, and that in addition to our meat bodies, we also have plasma bodies, and these interact with universal fields. What does this say about our own potential intelligence? More and more is being discovered about how the human brain works. We now know that individual neurons are not the elements of the brain. It is groups of neurons that are, and these in turn operate both in parallel and in a distributed sense. In other words, not solely in one area of the brain, but distributed across regions of the brain. This kind of brain processing is called parallel distributed processing. Another name for it is connectionism. I have written about this at very great length in another book, so cannot repeat it here. What is important for our purposes here is that intelligence emerges from the human brain, not by chemicals each next to each other, interacting by physical proximity, but by connections over a distance. Similarly, it is the concept of long-range order that is crucial to the integrity of any plasma cloud in space. This is what occurs when a very large collection of disparate particles suddenly comes together and forms a coherent entity, which extends its central control over a long distance, somehow imposing long-range order. This goes against a lot of conventional thinking, quote unquote, because it suggests action at a distance. Isaac Newton became nearly hysterical when people spoke of action at a distance. In Principia Mathematica 1713, he called it a philosophical absurdity, quote unquote. Albert Einstein was puzzled by it and called it spooky action at a distance, quote unquote. He and two colleagues formulated a famous concept in physics called the EPR paradox, the E being for Einstein, the P and the R being for the other guys. This was published in 1935 and dealt with particles coordinating their momenta when very far apart, so far in fact that they would have to exchange the information with each other by sending signals at greater than the speed of light. Since Einstein himself developed special relativity, which insists that the speed of light must be a universal constant that cannot be exceeded. He had a special interest in this unsolved paradox of physics. I myself have entered the special relativity debate on the side of the speed of light as co-author of a paper with my friend Otto Rossler, which was a great honor because he is one of the world's most famous chaos theory scientists and the discoverer of the Rossler attractor. The phenomenon of non-locality, as they call it, which was raised by this paradox, has so far been proved to occur over distances of 50 kilometers, and the phenomenon is no longer denied. A special case of non-locality is the now fashionable subject of quantum entanglement. Entanglement has become a buzzword. What it means is that at the microscopic quantum level, things far apart can still be in contact. In other words, can be entangled, quote unquote, with each other and interact. And the point about a huge plasma cloud that becomes an entity through coherence achieved despite non-locality is that elevates the quantum state from the microscopic to the macroscopic, in other words, from the tiny to the huge, the entire cloud becomes a macroscopic quantum entity. So how is it possible for quantum phenomena to operate at these huge sizes? We are told for decades that quantum phenomena occurred only at microscopic levels, but things have now changed. I suspect that the answer to all of this is what I discussed earlier, namely active information. Information does not have any energy or any mass. Uh, Maybe some beg to differ on that. I don't know. It is thus immune to the speed of light restriction, and which applies only to matter, waves, and so forth. In order to extend across vast distances, information can exceed the speed of light quite happily without breaking any laws, quote unquote. A distributed information network would act as a unifying factor to enable the cloud to achieve stability as an entity. In fact, the vast amount of information in itself might knit a filamentary network of connected elements constituting a brain, in which information processing would be inevitable. As as David Bohm and his colleague Basil Hiley stated in 1993, quote, we have seen that non-locality is contained in all the interpretations of the quantum theory that we have discussed so far. And our own ontological interpretation also contains non-locality as a basic feature, end quote. Long-range order, quote unquote, is an example of one of the outcomes that entanglement generates. This extraordinary phenomenon means that particles or things very far apart indeed can be closely coordinated and can behave as if they are all part of one centrally controlled organism. This is what is known as quantum entanglement, which we have already mentioned. Sometimes a system can suddenly undergo change, known in the jargon as a phase transition, and millions of apparently separate things in the system instantaneously begin to act as one. Imagine 1 million people sitting in bars and pubs around the world drinking casually with their friends, and suddenly, at the same instant, they all stand up to attention and give a salute, even though they do not know one another, have never met, or never will meet. This is a phase transition and is also referred to as the sudden onset of long-range order. No one is entirely sure how these things can happen in the natural world, but they do. And we now know that this form of coherence by means of long-range order, can happen within plasma crystals. This means that both information and energy can come from far away. Because of entanglement, not only can parts of giant dusty complex plasmas communicate with each other and from coherent patterns over distances and form coherent patterns over distances, but giant dusty complex plasmas at the opposite sides of the universe might in principle cooperate in the evolution of their intelligence. End of chapter 18, the last chapter. Now for the conclusion. We have seen in this book that the universe is over 99% plasma. We have seen that dusty complex plasma interacting with electromagnetic fields can evolve sufficient complexity to count as alive, quote unquote. We have seen too, in certain cases, that complex dusty plasmas contain such high levels of complexity that including quantum phenomena, that it may reasonably be speculated that they are also intelligent. The Kordylewski clouds hovering over the Earth may well be vastly more intelligent than human beings, or indeed all human beings put together, including all of those who have ever lived. So vast are the potential computing powers of the huge clouds, which together are 9 times the size of Earth, so that in size they dwarf our planet and its moon. We have seen that plasma may be a medium by which the bizarre behavior of particles and waves in the quantum realm may erupt into the human and macro realm. For example, in the manifestation of lightning balls, we have explored the role of plasma in the human body, showing that we may have a plasma body that shapes and sustains our physical body. We ourselves are in a sense plasmoids, and our dense matter's bodies made of those rare things, atoms like smart overcoats, quote unquote, that we discard when we die. The quest has only just begun. This book is intended to inform you of what is possible. Once you grasp this, you can begin to realize what you really are. And that is the conclusion of this book. I don't know if I'm going to read the appendices. Um, in conclusion, from me reading this for the second time, I think if it obviously it like he says, it's the beginning to realize that there's more to reality than we obviously know. That's like Captain Obvious statement, but at least now this kind of gives us pointers into where we can focus certain scientific studies. And some of those studies can obviously lead to rather dubious implications of what can be done as far as weapons um, development has probably already done as far as DARPA is concerned. But it also paves way for other instances of what conspiracy theorists are always talking about, how the new world order is right around the corner and everything, and that they're going to deceive us all with uh, signs and wonders and stuff. Basically, uh, whether it's a Christian eschatology or any other kind of eschatology, there could potentially be a lot of technology behind it all that really could just fool us being uh, into basically believing in the new world order if it hasn't already happened yet. That's another just tangent, I guess. I don't know where I'm going with this, so I just find this book really fascinating, and it ties into a lot of things, so many things that are related. But yeah, that's it for basically this chapter and this book. So
Let those teddy beasts worship the mud now.